Hello. Hello, police. Yeah, what's the problem, sir? We just drove down our farm track. Yeah. Go and feed our pheasants. We come across a Range Rover with 3 people in it. Yeah. It appears that they're dead. I don't know what's happening. Blood in the motor all over them.
And welcome back to a new video on the Essex Boys case. As always, if you are enjoying the content, please do give the video a thumbs up. And if you're interested in the Essex Boys case, or simply true crime in general, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. And in this video, we're going to be taking a look at a different alternative motive for Tucker, Tate and Rolfe being at Workhouse Lane on the night they died. We are going to look at a news story which was from a month before the murders, in which £500,000 worth of cannabis was recovered from a fishing pond no more than 6 miles away. Could this be the reason that Tucker, Tate and Rolfe were at the lane that evening? It wasn't down to a drug deal or a plane that was going to be landing, or even looking at an airstrip that didn't even exist. The simple fact of the matter is they wanted to get through the gate to check out the fishing ponds, where they'd been told a large amount of cannabis had been dropped. Okay, so let's take a look at a newspaper article which was actually printed on the 3rd of the 11th, 1995. So around 1 month before the murders of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. This newspaper article is from the Essex Chronicle, and the title of this article is £500,000 of drugs were dropped from aircraft. Police believe that bungling drug dealers could have dropped more than £500,000 worth of cannabis in a farmer's pond from an aircraft by mistake. The tightly packed cannabis in black plastic packets was fished from the water in West Hanningfield by Essex police divers. 4 packets had been originally spotted by the farmer Jens Halstrup near the edge of the pond. Sergeant Nigel Dermott, who led the diving operation, said, "I have never seen anything like it. The haul is believed to be the biggest of its type in Essex." Police forensic scientists are drying out some of the 53 packets to try to discover its source. The haul weighed more than 300 weight. Detective Chief Inspector Brian Story, head of Chelmsford CID, praised Mr Halstrup for quickly alerting police. He said it was possible that the cannabis had been dropped from an aircraft. Okay, so before we make any assumptions regarding any sort of connection between the two events, i.e. the drug drop at West Hanningfield and the murders of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe, firstly let's deal with a few facts. Now, the distance between West Hanningfield and White House Farm in Rettendon, where Tucker, Tate and Rolfe were murdered, is around a 7-minute drive, depending on where this pond was actually located. It is probably between a 4 and 6 mile distance, basically nothing at all between these two locations. And do bear in mind that these locations are, they're not isolated as such, but they're not sort of an urban environment. It's not a city, it's not a town. These are sort of like village locations. So the village of Rettendon and West Hanningfield, they're not out in the sticks as such, but they're not what you would class as a sort of bustling urban environment. So, you know, the fact that these two places are actually close together is quite interesting. Now, the second thing we need to look at is if these drugs were dropped in this pond, then it was done quite clearly by someone who was flying a plane. Now, we already know of someone who is highly qualified in flying planes, who has been qualified since the 1970s, and who was multi-engine rated in that field, meaning that he could fly any propeller aircraft. Did this drug drop actually come in through Michael Steele? Was this Michael Steele who dropped these drugs in this pond? Now, I mean, obviously that's a massive assumption in a lot of ways, but what we can say for quite, a great deal with a great deal of certainty is that Michael Steele had the capability and the experience to certainly have been involved in an operation like this. Now, the next thing that I want you to consider is the fact that this story actually made the local press, and that really, it is important in some ways and it isn't in others. What I mean by that is that it was a known event. It wasn't like the cannabis was dropped there and no one found it. This farmer actually found it. He contacted police. This then led to an investigation. The word would have been out around the criminal circles that this had happened. £500,000 worth, even if it is street value, is obviously a very large quantity of cannabis. Now, you can only imagine, if you just put yourself for one moment in the circles of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe, there's going to be conversations of who was responsible for this. There's going to be people that knew who was responsible for this. There's going to be the person himself who actually dropped the drugs in the pond. It's going to be something that's talked about and discussed within those circles. Now, what is interesting is that we have these two very small places, very close together, and they are the scene of, two quite big events. Obviously, the triple murder being the biggest of them all. But the fact that £500,000 worth of cannabis was found 6 miles away in a pond is also potentially connected, I feel, to the fact that Tucker, Tate and Rolfe were found dead no more than 6 miles away, just down the road. Now, why I feel that is because there are connections here between West Hanningfield and what is also located at White House Farm. And that is quite clearly the presence of large fishing ponds. Now, just think for a moment, what are the chances of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe being found dead right in front of a gate which leads to 2 or 3 very large fishing ponds, when only 1 month before that, £500,000 worth of cannabis, the drug that they primarily deal in, along with ecstasy, was found just 6 miles away? Now, what you have to think about, or at least what I am thinking about, is what was their motivation for putting themselves in that situation, a dark lane, in a vulnerable position, and to be quite honest, they're unarmed. Now, we are told they were going to look either at an airstrip, or they were waiting for a plane, or they were simply going to look at where a plane was going to land. But I can tell you with a fair deal of certainty that there is no way that you could land a plane in any of those fields. Now, think of this from Tucker and Tate's situation. Would you travel down a dark, freezing cold lane, not knowing really where it led to or where you would end up, putting yourself in a vulnerable situation, especially after the Leah Betts scenario? Tensions were high, people were nervous, there was some anxiety, there was some tension between everyone involved in this situation. Now, would you believe that a plane was going to land in one of those fields? Or would you be more lured there on the premise that £500,000 worth of drugs was actually dropped in one of those fishing ponds, either by accident or intentionally? Now, why I believe this is also potentially credible is the fact that there are witness statements which mention seeing a Range Rover, a blue Range Rover, hanging around the lane in the days and weeks leading up to their deaths. I believe that Tucker, Tate and Rolfe had knowledge of Workhouse Lane before the day of their murder. That tells me that if they had knowledge of the lane and the knowledge of the surrounding area, then it would have been even more unfeasible to believe that someone was going to land a plane, especially somewhere that they had knowledge that they couldn't possibly land one, if that makes sense. If someone tells you someone's going to land a plane in your back garden, you're not going to believe them because you know the layout of the land, you know how big the surface area is, you know how possible that would be. Now, it's also worth remembering that Tony Tucker knew the farmer's brother who found him dead. He knew White House Farm. He more than likely knew Workhouse Lane. And when someone comes up to you and says, there's a drug deal going down, we're going to hold up this plane that's coming in, it's going to land in one of these fields at White House Farm, even if you feel that, okay, that's a possibility, even if you felt a little bit uneasy by that, then surely you would take some precautions. You would be armed. You would have as many people with you as possible to ensure your protection. Do remember that at this time, the heat was really coming down on Tucker, Tate and Rolfe, mainly via the Leah Betts situation, and mainly down to the fact that the police were investigating who had sold these pills. Even Tony Tucker himself mentioned to his then girlfriend that he was anxious and he felt he just wasn't acting himself. So there were some sort of underlying tensions here, Would they have travelled down that lane unarmed? Would they have believed that a plane was ever going to land in a field as small as that? I actually have a friend who works in aviation, who is a product developer in the aviation business. And when I showed him this field, how big it was, and how possible it was to actually land a small aircraft there, he said it was basically impossible, because you need a certain amount of space in order to take off again. It's not so much the landing that's the problem, it's the surface area required to get the aeroplane up to speed in order to take off again. Quite simply, it would not be possible to land a plane there in the first place. So was there ever a plane that was going to land in these fields? Were Tucker, Tate and Rolfe really that sort of carefree and almost gullible, I guess, to believe that a plane was going to land there at any point in time? What would be more luring? What is more believable? Is it the fact that, £500,000 or potentially even more worth of drugs lay in one of those fishing ponds? They were being shown where those ponds were. Maybe they weren't planning to necessarily go skinny dipping that evening to recover the drugs, but they were just being shown exactly where they could be located, and they then planned to return at a later date in order to find them. Is that why they attended this scene at that specific time, around 6:30? Because they were told that the farmer would be finished, walking across his land or feeding his pheasants. Were they told that the coast would be clear any time after 6 p.m? So they decide just to nip down there, just to take a look at where these fishing ponds are located. They can't stay too long because they've got a date at the restaurant. And that's why they head down there, just to check out exactly where these fishing ponds are. And they're then going to return at a later date. From there, they then plan to leave pretty quickly and head to the restaurant to enjoy a meal with their girlfriends. Also, we can think about the connection with Darren Nichols. We know that Darren Nichols took the duff cannabis and buried it in some pits. We know that he had connections with hiding cannabis, with dumping cannabis, with disposing of cannabis. We also know that his connection with DC Jim, the corrupt police officer, was discussing stealing Michael Steele's drugs from his Jaguar. So was this the lure to get Tucker, Tate and Rolfe to the lane? Is that how they also got Michael Steele and Jack Womes there? Was this actually planned by other people other than Michael Steele and Jack Womes? If we go back and look at the phone records, we know that Darren Nichols was the first person to establish contact on December the 6th. It was Darren Nichols who was urgently trying to get hold of Michael Steele. Was Darren Nichols someone who had knowledge of where certain things would be located, where certain things would have been dumped? Was it Darren Nichols who was making the phone calls from the telephone box at the Sorrel Horse Inn? Was it Darren Nichols who was forwarding the information onto Tucker, onto Steele? Was he rounding up the whole gang in order to go and take a look at this fishing pond where potentially a great deal of treasure could be located? Could this have been orchestrated and planned and set up by DC Jim or contacts of him? Was it DC Jim that got in contact with Darren Nichols to give him a tip-off on where some treasure or where some drugs could be located? From there, Darren Nichols is frantically trying to call Steele to inform him of the news. Steele then contacts Tucker, Tate and Rolfe, and they all head down there together to take a look at where these fishing ponds are located. Now, why I feel there's a possibility here that there is a connection between these two events, i.e. the finding of £500,000 worth of cannabis in a farmer's field in West Hanningfield, and also the triple murders of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe, is the fact not so much the distance between the two places, although that is extremely intriguing, i.e. it was only around 6 miles between these two locations. It's more to do with the fact that only 4 weeks had passed between the finding of this massive haul in a farmer's pond in West Hanningfield and the murder of 3 well-known drug dealers. Now, also think just how safe a journey like this would be perceived by Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. If they had news from someone they trusted that something could be found beyond the locked gate, they could simply take a trip down there. They didn't have long until their dinner date with their girlfriends, so they thought they'd make a quick trip down to take a look at the location of what lay beyond this locked gate. Could the person who have passed this information on to them have done it with the best will in the world? He wasn't trying to set them up. He had had news from someone else that he trusted. Someone like DC Jim, who had his fingers in a lot of pies. He had a lot of connections. He was trusted by Darren Nichols. And who is the person that is orchestrating, who is frantically trying to reach everybody on the day of their murders? It's none other than Darren Nichols. I guess you have to believe that the news of this find, this haul that was found in West Hanningfield, just a month before their murders, would have been big news in the criminal underworld, in the criminal circuit. Who had dumped it there? Who had made the mistake? Who had invested in this deal? What simpler way to make money than to go and recover another load of drugs which had been dropped in a field or in a pond no more than 6 miles away? It would be easy money, risk-free. You wouldn't have to invest anything in order to make a profit. It's simply a case of locating the fishing pond, recovering the drugs, and then selling them on. It's a no-hassle way to make an incredible amount of money. Now, could this all be completely coincidental? What are the chances of two small villages no more than 10 miles apart from each other being the event of quite big news? £500,000 worth of cannabis being found, 3 well-known drug dealers shot dead, a Range Rover matching the description of Tucker, Tate and Rolf's being seen in the location of Workhouse Lane in the days and weeks leading up to their death, the fact that Darren Nichols had information, he had experience in dumping drugs and recovering them. We also have the plan from DC Jim to really sort of bring down Michael Steele's operation to steal £150,000 worth of his own drugs. We have two people here who are kind of working against Michael Steele in DC Jim and Darren Nichols. We have an insider in Darren Nichols. We also have someone who has the capability and the power to retrieve drugs, to get a reward for those drugs in DC Jim. And probably the most important question to ask yourself at home is what you would feel more comfortable doing. What would you find more credible if you were Tucker, Tate and Rolf? Would you find it more credible that a plane was going to land in a relatively small field with a Class A commodity, and you would go and rob that commodity, or at least be shown where this plane was going to land, despite having what I believe to be knowledge of the area itself already in Tony Tucker? Or would you find it more believable that just a month earlier £500,000 worth of cannabis was dumped in a pond just up the road, and what lays beyond this 5-bar locked gate is yet more large fishing ponds, in fact 3 of them here in front of you? Do you believe that Tony Tucker, Pat Tate and Craig Rolfe headed down that lane with the intention of locating these ponds to return again later, at a later date I should say, to recover these drugs? That's why they were potentially dressed the way they were, with boots, jeans and black jackets, although that was a common fashion trend back in the 1990s, especially around 1995. Was that the reason they were there? It was a short trip. It wasn't some big deal. It wasn't something that involved other people. Hence the reason they weren't armed. Hence the reason they had a restaurant date, a very short period of time booked, for just after their murders. Is that how it was ensured that everyone would be present at the scene? Was Darren Nichols the messenger boy? Was he the person with the information on where these drugs could be found? That is how he could rope in Michael Steele and Jack Womes to go with him. And who better to take with you than the person who is going to sell that product, the person that could test that product, that person who could see how good the product actually was and the quantity that they recover in Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. Okay, so just to summarise a few key points from this episode, I guess when I look at this crime and this case in general, the best place to start, especially when looking at the crime scene itself, is to try and find the motivation, most importantly, of why Tucker, Tate and Rolfe ended up at the bottom of that lane by the locked 5-bar gate. If there is no landing strip beyond this gate, if there is no field large enough to accommodate an aircraft beyond this gate, then what else could be the motivation to bring them there to the lane that evening? And what I can find here, or what I believe is another possibility, is the presence of these large fishing ponds, which no more than 4 weeks earlier and just 6 miles away was the scene of a farmer recovering £500,000 worth of drugs which had been dropped from a light aircraft. By accident, they dropped it in the wrong place, they dropped it in the wrong pond. A massive error had been made somewhere down the line, and someone was out of pocket to probably the best part of £200,000 to £500,000. Was this the motivation for Tucker, Tate and Rolfe heading down the lane that evening? It was a short journey. They weren't going to be there particularly long. They didn't have torches with them or anything like that, or wetsuits in order to recover these drugs. They were just going down there to see where these ponds were located. They couldn't stay too long because a short while after this time, they had a restaurant booking with their girlfriends. Combine that with the fact that Tucker, Tate and Rolfe weren't supposedly armed that evening. It was a quick journey. It was some information that had been passed on to them by someone that they trusted, potentially even someone who was travelling in the Range Rover with them to see where these drugs were located. It wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a drug deal. It wasn't anything that sort of raised suspicion, such as landing an aircraft in a small field. All the story matched up. It had been in the news. It had been talked about in criminal circles for the past few weeks. Who had made the mistake of dumping the drugs in West Hanningfield? By the way, there's more drugs to be found just 6 miles down the road at White House Farm, in the fishing ponds. Could it have been put to them that even more drugs could be found than the haul that was discovered in West Hanningfield? It just seemed almost too good to be true, an opportunity that couldn't be passed up. They wouldn't need to invest anything in this deal. They wouldn't need to use their guns. They wouldn't need to hold anybody up. It would just take a couple of people to get a bit wet in order to recover the treasure that lay beneath the surface. And interestingly, just off of a sidetrack quickly, is that also why Michael Steele and Jack Williams were surprised by the gate being locked? Because the gate was supposed to be open. The Range Rover was supposed to drive through to go and look at the fishing ponds. Is that where Darren Nichols twisted the version of events? Because as far as I'm concerned, no one would plan to commit a triple murder in a large open field. The gate had to be locked in order to secure Tucker, Tate and Rolfe in that position to be executed. Was it a surprise for Michael Steele and Jack Williams to see that this gate was locked at that time? Because they had hoped it was open so the Range Rover could drive through further on into the fields and to check out the fishing ponds. That's also something worth mentioning. If you would like to learn more about the Range Rover murders as told in court, then please click on the video in front of you now. You'll also see the Essex Boys playlist, which has an array of separate videos regarding this case in one convenient folder. Many thanks for joining me for this video. I look forward to seeing you all again for the next one. Take care. Cheers.